Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories from First UCC. I'm John Bauman, and we are on Chapter 8 of The King's Messenger by Carolyn, Clare Givens, illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. This is Chapter 8, The King's Victory. The battle fought not his own, the victory won for the throne, the credit not for him to take, the praise for another's sake. That's a poem, an anonymous poem. Starting the chapter. The royal prince's palace was at the northernmost edge of the city, its great terraces and windows overlooking the surrounding fields. The only thing Smuggins had really enjoyed about his time there was a view from the terraces early in the morning, when the fields were masked in gauzy mist. The farmers would just be bringing their oxen and plows out, and their movement made the fog royal like steam atop a boiling pot of stew. Smuggins made sure he got up early enough to have a few minutes to look out at the pastoral scene. On the seventh day at the royal prince's palace, he took his customary walk on the terrace, where he was joined by Misha. "I'm ready to go back home," Misha said. "Me too," Smuggins agreed. There's not much to be said for a life of changing bed linens. When Smuggins and Misha had arrived a week earlier with the message, they had found the household overwhelmed with illness, and they had stayed to help the harried staff. "I never realized how much I enjoy the excitement of the king's courtroom," Misha said, and turned to look out at the scene. After a moment, she pointed out to the horizon. "Smuggins, what's that?" Smuggins looked to where she was pointing and saw a line of dark forms coming up over a far ridge. The mist had not yet fully cleared, and he could not yet see them clearly. I don't know," he said. They both peered into the distance, trying to decipher what they observed. After a moment, Misha gasped, "Smuggins, it's an army!" Suddenly, the dark forms seemed to solidify and become clear. Men on horseback and marching soldiers carrying swords and daggers. At the center of the line, the tallest man on the tallest horse was followed closely by a banner-bearer with a flag. The wind caught the fabric and it grew taut. It bore an insignia Smuggins knew well. "It's the enemy." "We have to tell the king," Misha said, turning from the view to go indoors. "Hurry, Smuggins," she called back. Smuggins tore his eyes away from the approaching line of soldiers and followed Misha. They ran through the palace halls to the royal prince's quarters. Your Highness! Your Highness!" Smuggins called out as they approached. The door opened and the royal prince stepped into the hall. "What is it?" he asked. Your Highness!" Misha panted. The enemy is coming!" "What?" The royal prince's face showed his confusion. "What do you mean?" Look out your window," Smuggins said. "The enemy comes with an army." The royal prince ran to the window and peered out into the distance. Seeing the dark army approaching, he turned back to Smuggins and Misha. "The message must be taken to my brother the king," he said. "I will raise my fighting men in order and form our defense. But word must be sent. Will you go?" "Of course, your Highness. Of course, your Highness," Misha said. "We'll go together," Smuggins said. "I have my sword." The royal prince looked out again at the approaching army. "Make haste. They close quickly, and the king's courtroom is a long way through the city. Take care. The enemy may have agents already here." Smuggins and Misha left the royal prince to raise his fighting men. They ran to Smuggins's quarters, where he opened his trunk to get his short sword and dagger. Strapping them around his waist, he stood. Misha turned to him from the window and said, "Hurry! They are nearly here!" As they made their way out of the royal prince's palace, they could hear the clash of battle begin at the outskirts of the city. As they hurried through the city streets, the bustle of a typical morning was in full swing. It was impossible to move very quickly between the carts and wagons moving toward the marketplace. The word of the king's arrival was flowing through the city, moving more quickly than Smuggins and Misha. "The enemy is here. The royal prince raised his fighting men. Do you think the royal prince's men can hold him off?" Smuggins began to shuffle his feet and tap his finger on the hilt of his sword. "We have to get there. I don't think we can take the main road. It's too crowded." Misha peered ahead through the crowd. "Maybe there's another way." Spotting an empty alleyway, they darted down it. They wound through the dark passageways behind the buildings, trying to move in the direction of the king's courtroom. After some time, Smuggins slowed his steps. "Misha," he said, looking forward and back, I think we're lost." We can't be," Misha cried, stopping. "We have to get to the king. We have to take him the message." Smuggins' heart sank. "He may hear the message before we get there. Let's try to find our way." They hurried ahead and turned another corner. The alley before them was dim, tall buildings on either side. The morning light had not pierced it. There was a sound ahead, and Misha grasped Smuggins by the arm, gasping, "Did you hear that?" "Shh," Smuggins said. He listened for a moment, then calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The darkness ahead seemed to stir, and a few men stepped forward to be seen. "What's going on?" one of them asked. "Can you tell us which direction we should go?" Smuggins said. "We're messengers for the king, and we have to get to his courtroom." "You have a message for the king?" the man asked. The enemy has come," Misha cried. He's even here now at the edge of the city. We must tell the king." The men were quiet for a moment, and Smuggins suddenly grew cold with dread. The leading man spoke again. "Well, that is a message that we don't want the king to get." He and the others pulled out weapons that they had concealed by the dimness of the alley. "No!" Smuggins drew his sword and dagger quickly. He couldn't imagine how the enemy's servants had infiltrated the city, but there was not time to wonder. "Misha, get behind me!" "Yes, my lady messenger," the man sneered. "You won't get your message to the king today." Smuggins tensed for battle, felt Misha's hand on his arm. "Smuggins," she said quietly, "we'll fight them together in the name of the king." She glanced over at her in surprise and saw her eyes fixed on the men. I can handle a sword," she said. Smuggins looked back at the men, who took a step forward, shattering the frozen scene. Smuggins sprang into action, handing Misha his short sword. He changed his dagger to his other hand and whirled around so that he was on the far side of the alley. When the enemy's followers rushed to attack, Smuggins and Misha faced them from either side. There was a clash of metal, and suddenly they were in the fury of battle. Smuggins lost track of time. He didn't know how long they had been fighting when they heard Misha cry out, and looking over saw blood blooming over her sleeve from a wound on her arm. Then he screamed with pain himself as a blade struck his leg, slicing through the muscle. He thrust out his dagger and hit true. Smuggins grew dizzy as blood flowed from his wound, and he found it difficult to stand. Looking up, he saw the leader of the enemy's followers bearing down upon Misha as she desperately tried to defend herself. He gathered all the strength he had, pushed off from the wall behind him, and rushed at the man. He pulled the man back just before his sword came down on Misha, and threw him to the far side of the alley. Misha struggled and caught Smuggins under the arm before he fell. "Let's go," she said, and supporting him hurried back toward the main road. It seemed that the enemy's forces had breached the city and were ahead of them. The remnants of battle were strewn in the city streets, and in the houses on either side. Citizens were just beginning to peer out from behind closed shutters. It didn't take them long to get to the king's courtroom, where they found the battle over. "Help!" Misha cried out as they approached. Smuggins is badly hurt." Some of the king's messengers rushed into the courtyard to help. Oniggins, Coggins, and Figgins took Smuggins from Misha. As they hurried back indoors, Misha followed on Sasha's arm, still carrying Smuggins' sword. Smuggins had lost so much blood that he was barely conscious, but he tried to listen to the account of the other messengers as they bound his wound and told him of the battle he had missed. They all seemed to speak at once. "Oh, Smuggins, you should have been here," Coggins said. "The enemy was at the gate, and his army was close behind him," Oniggins cut in. "When they had entered the courtroom, the king stepped down from his throne and went out to meet him," Figgins continued. "The enemy just nodded to his men, and they dropped back, and he stood to face the king alone. It all happened so fast. The enemy said, 'I've come for the throne,' and the king said, 'It can never be yours.' I've never seen the king angry like that. The look on his face, I can't describe it. I fell to my knees right there. and then they both rushed each other. I thought for a moment that the enemy was winning, but then I heard the enemy say, "Who's the master now?" And then the king threw one more blow and said, in so quiet and powerful and still a voice, the king said, "I am." And it was all over. The enemy was defeated. For a moment, everyone was quiet, and I don't think the enemy's army knew what to do. The king said, "If you wish to serve me, lay down your arms." The swords clattered to the ground all over, and the rest turned tail and ran faster than you could say victory. Smuggins heard all the voices, but it was as if he was far away. After a few moments he closed his eyes and gave up the struggle to remain conscious. It was a few days before they were all able to gather together in the king's courtroom again. Smuggins's injury was severe, and even when he could stand without growing dizzy, he needed the support of a crutch. He stood as straight and tall as possible in the line of messengers and watched the celebration going on before him. Every courtier in the kingdom seemed to have come to the king's courtroom to celebrate his victory. The walls of the room were bedecked with garlands of flowers, and the king wore his richest robes. There were speeches from various noblemen and honors given to soldiers who had fought valiantly in the battle for the city. Finally, the royal prince stood and turned the attention to the king's defeat of his enemy, and the room erupted into the greatest cheer of them all. In response, the king stood and waited for the crowd to quiet. As they did, he spoke. "There are other names which should be spoken today," he said. "On that terrible day when we fought against the enemy for this very throne, 2 of my messengers failed in the task they were assigned." Smuggins glanced over at Misha, surprised by the king's word. Misha didn't return the look, but kept her eyes on the king's face as he continued. "Smuggins and Misha were sent by the royal prince to bring the first news of the enemy's arrival to this courtroom, but they arrived too late to warn us. They came after the battle was over. I do not tell this tale to fault them in any way, for I have spoken with Misha, who has told me what happened that morning. As they made their way through the city, they found themselves waylaid by servants of the enemy, who wanted nothing more than to thwart their purpose. Smuggins and Misha found these servants of the enemy together in my name and were victorious. Fought these servants of the enemy together in my name and were victorious. Both were injured in the skirmish, but are here with us today. Smuggins and Misha, step forth." Smuggins and Misha stepped forward and spoke in unison. "At your service, your majesty." The king stepped down from his throne and came toward them. He stopped before Smuggins and saw that he wanted to speak. "What have you to say, Smuggins?" the king asked. "Your majesty," Smuggins said, "I thank you for the honor, but I don't feel that I should have it. I was simply doing my duty as a messenger, and I didn't do that very well anyway. Today is your day of victory, your majesty. You've honored me so many times. Today, we are here to honor you." The king looked over at Misha, who was nodding her head in agreement with Smuggins, and he smiled at them both. He turned back and said, "Smuggins, in the past I have taken your failures as my own responsibility. Today I take your great act to my glory." The king paused. "What you did in my name brings me honor." That's the end of our reading of Chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry that I'm not in my usual settings, but I am preparing the service for Sunday, which I hope that all of you will watch with your parents and your families. So hopefully you enjoyed this bedtime story, and tune in on Monday for Chapter 9.